Welcome to our Dynamics 365 Finance Integration with SmartConnect webinar. I am Chris Hansen. If you haven't seen me on one of these webinars before, or if you haven't met me or talked to me, I'm the current SmartConnect product manager here at E1 Solutions. So this summer and spring, I've been doing a series of webinars around SmartConnect 21, SmartConnect.com, different features, functionality we have. And for today, what we're going through is our new finance connection that we have in SmartConnect. So I'm not going to keep my webcam on the whole time. Just wanted to say hi, like I do at the start. Again, for anybody that's watching live, I encourage you to use the chat and the question panel. I do like live feedback. That's one of the benefits you get if you're watching it live, is you can interact with me a little bit versus watching a recording. If you're watching this on a recording, well, I still hope you enjoy the session here, and we'll kind of get into it. So let me turn off my webcam so that isn't distracting, and then we'll kind of get into what we're going to go through for the session. So if you've been on any of my webinars this year, you'll know that my slide deck is very thin. I've got this title slide and I've got the Q&A. So what I do during the session is I spend the entire time either in product or in screens related to what I'm talking about. So I will go through a quick overview of what I'm going to discuss, just so anyone that's seen this video randomly kind of knows the order that I'm going to go through things in. But to start with, we'll talk about the F&O connection. And again, apologies if I intermix terminology. So I've been around for a while. AX, F&O, 365 Finance, FNSCM, it's all the same to me. So apologies if I flip up that terminology when I'm talking about it. But in any case, we're going to talk about the connector in general in SmartConnect, how we connect to it, what services we're using. We will actually walk through how to set up the initial connection in SmartConnect to Dynamics 365 Finance, because that's, again, if you can get that connection set up, then you can kind of play around with it. And there's a few extra steps now that Microsoft requires using their modern authentication. So I want to make sure that's clear. Then I'm going to open up one of my existing integrations that's going to finance, talk about a few of the new features we have in there, talk about a few unique things that are going to be different from other integrations that you may have created in SmartConnect, and then also briefly touch on the data source piece of it. So again, it's not a full training session. I don't want to walk through step by step on how to build stuff, but I do want to point out key features and functionality that we have. And I also want to talk about what we're working on that isn't released yet, that's coming, which again, if you've seen a few of my other sessions, you might have an idea of what's already in the works for this year with regards to F&O and SmartConnect. So once again, if you're live, go ahead, ask questions as I'm going through. I'm fine diving in deeper to any topic that you guys are curious about. You can also use that as suggestions or features, functionality that you want to see, or if you're not sure that we have in terms of what you're looking for integration. Always willing to take a look at that, especially if it's related to the topic at hand of F&O. So with that, I'm going to end our slideshow, and we'll take a look at SmartConnect. So first off, the F&O connection is available only in SmartConnect.com right at this moment. So again, I'm broadcasting this here in September of 2022. We are working on the on-premise version of it, so it'll be present in SmartConnect 21 shortly. But right now, if you're interested in seeing F&O and SmartConnect, you have to use SmartConnect.com, and it is at the top subscription level. It's at the premium level for subscription. Same thing will apply when it comes to SmartConnect 21. You'll have to be at the premium level for either perpetual or subscription. The reason we're doing this is F&O is a bit more of an enterprise level product. Normally we're going to have a bit more data volume. The functionality, the way we connect, takes a bit more effort. So it's at the higher end of our subscription tiers for SmartConnect. So wanted to make that clear. If anyone's looking for it, if they can't see it, if they don't find it, can't enable it, that would be why, if they're not in .com and if they're not on the top subscription level. So I do have a connection set up already. I'm going to walk through what I had to do outside of SmartConnect, both in the Azure portal and inside of Dynamics 365 Finance to get this connection to work initially. So if you've been around, if you've worked with either F&O, if you've worked with Business Central or CRM Customer Engagement, you'll know Microsoft has been changing their authentication lately and requiring you to connect through OAuth. OAuth 2, either using a registered app or doing a kind of like a pass-through authentication where you click through and accept the app permissions as you're working with that. So what I've got is an F&O connection here. And this one, just like any recent Business Central or recent customer engagement connections, requires a client ID and a client secret for us to connect with. Description is going to be whatever you want in here. The site URL or URI is going to be the actual URL for your particular F&O implementation. So that's going to be specific to you. And then the client ID and client secret, that's something we have to grab from the Azure portal. So this is one thing I am going to walk through as if it was a training session, just to make sure we're clear on this. Anyone picking this up, curious on what they're seeing, this is how it is going to work here. Also, this is documented out on our site. If you go to the smartconnect.unsolutions.com, we have articles on how to set up the authentication, building your first F&O destination, building your first data source, and using the F&O additional column. So that is all documented as well. Don't have to listen to this if that's all you're here for, is those steps. You can find them in writing as well. But if we were walking through this, what it requires in SmartConnect, and we're doing this for all the, again, like I said, all the Dynamics products except for GP, you can still connect to that the traditional way. We're doing it through an app registration inside of Azure. So I'll just create a new one for this particular session, just so you can see what this ends up looking like. So I'm going to call it SC Finance Demo. Why not? For the name, the supported account type, this isn't that important for the SmartConnect perspective. This is based on your organization, how you've set up your Azure AD and who's actually connecting to your environments. Most clients we work with, you can leave it at single tenant, so it's going to be just their organization that connects. The redirect URI, this is going to be coming from SmartConnect. So if I actually go back into here, if you set up a new connection or if you open an existing one, there is the redirect URL inside of here. We can grab that, and that's just what you paste inside of here. For those curious or those aren't sure why that's needed, when you do like an OAuth authentication, there has to be kind of a handshake between the system that's providing verifying the authentication and then the request where it's coming from, which would be us in this case, and that has to go back and forth. So that callback URL is used to let, in this case, the Azure authenticator or the validator know where this call is coming from and where to send that request back to when it says, hey, we know it's you, here it's part of the handshake, can you verify this and complete the connection? So if you don't do that redirect URI, the setup isn't going to work correctly, and this does change for you. It changes in a couple ways. One, it will change per region you're in SmartConnect. So if you're in the North America region, it's going to look very similar to mine. If you're in, say, EU West or UK or Australia, you're going to have a slightly different URI inside of here. Also, if you're working with Business Central or customer engagement, this is going to change as well. The end of the URL is going to change to what you need there. So the good news is you can go ahead and set up these registered applications. You can put multiple redirect URIs on the same application if you need to. So if you're using customer engagement and F&O or Business Central and customer engagement or whatever combination, you can set up one registered app or app registration and put in multiple redirect URIs in there to handle all of your requests. So after it builds this base app registration, we have to give it a few permissions on here. One thing I wanted to point out is the redirect URIs. This is where you could add additional ones if we needed to. So if you want your registered app to handle different connections to different systems. The other thing we need is the API permissions. So by default, it doesn't have much in there. We can just read some user information off of there. But what I'm looking for is going to be the Dynamics ERP. If we click on that, we can go ahead and run it as delegated or application permissions under here. I'm going to use delegated permissions. What this is going to do is it's going to say first time the app is going to attempt to connect through my connection string, it will pop up a box saying, hey, do you allow this app to connect? Can it connect as you? Which I'm going to say yes to, and then it's going to be able to have all those rights to my F&O system. So by default, we do need all three of these marked under here for the delegated permissions. AX full access, so even in Azure, Microsoft still calls it AX instead of finance. AX full access, custom service full access, and then OData full access. The reason we need these is, well, one, we work with the OData services on Dynamics 365 Finance. Those are the endpoints we're connecting to. And I'll talk a bit more about that later when we look at the destination side of it. We also connect to custom services that you may publish inside of Finance. So if you create an object, you mark it as public. If that shows up in the custom OData service metadata, then we're going to pull that in, and we're using it through this endpoint as well. So the short story of it is we want those three in there. This is what your API permission should look like if you're connecting to Finance. The final thing we have to do inside of here is create a new client secret. And this is where we're going to get the client secret value from when we're actually in the connection window here. So the first time you set up a client secret, I can go ahead and I'll just call it test secret. I don't know if I'm fully going to use this particular one. I can set the expiry date on here. Azure doesn't let you set anything out further than 24 months, so 2 years from now. So at a maximum value 2 years from now, someone's going to have to come in and create a new secret and update the connection window inside of SmartConnect. That is an eternity in tech timelines, so shouldn't worry about that too much. You're going to have many other applications and updates you need to do to authentication before that expires. So 24 months is the longest Azure lets you do it. When you create it, it's going to create a secret ID and a secret value. This value is what we're actually using inside of SmartConnect for this particular value here. So in the future, we will say client secret value, so it's clear that's the value, not the ID that you need, but it's the actual value that has to be put in place here. Same with any other window in SmartConnect that's asking for a secret. So you'll want to copy that out to your clipboard. Azure, the moment you leave this window, when you come back, this value will not be displayed. So if I move off of it and come back here, I did lie. At some point, when you save this, it will no longer show that value. I promise you, it hides it after a certain point. I know Microsoft does that. I don't know why there we go. It even says it right on here. So save it before leaving the page. For some reason, it's letting me flip off to a different page and come back to it. But when you fully save that app and open it back up, this isn't visible. So the important thing is you do want to copy that out for use. So it takes that secret value, and the other thing it takes is going to be your actual application ID up here. So the app ID and the secret value are what gets plugged into the client ID and the client secret. And then when we validate, this is what's going to go ahead and connect. So didn't have me signed in. When I connect, it's going to prompt me to sign in again on here. I'm going to say stay signed in at this point. So this will complete the validation process. If it's the very first time we've done this, it would also pop up a window saying, hey, this is a new application. Are you sure you want to give it access to your system? And we're going to go ahead and say yes, and we're going to get our company list back inside of here. So my demo company, or my demo F&O, has quite a few different companies. You pick your default one that you want to work with as part of this process. One other quick thing on the authentication is in F&O itself, you actually have to set up a step in here as well. So when I go over here, let's say I'm still here, there is a window in F&O called Azure Active Directory Applications. You do have to come in here, click New, and we have to add in that client ID or that application ID in here as well. That's the only thing it needs. It needs that client ID. The name, you can name it whatever you want in here, and then it needs a service user to run under. So F&O has an extra security layer that Business Central and Customer Engagement do not. So Business Central Customer Engagement, the moment you create that registered application, it has permissions to connect to your system. Inside F&O, you actually have to come in here, add it to this list. It's kind of like a whitelist. It's letting them know, hey, this is the app ID. If we see these requests coming in, another layer of security saying we should let this through and let it run. So that's the extra step in here. It takes 10 seconds to open up the window, plug in the client ID from that application and save it. My existing connection's already using it. We use this for a bit of testing, so we got quite a few in here as well. But generally, you'll just have that one or two, depending on how many different ways you're connecting to your F&O environment. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Spent a bit of time on the authentication or connection piece of it, but it is quite a bit different from the old days where you were on, everything's on premise. You just connect to SQL or whatever interface they have on top of that, and you're good to go. Now everything is running through Microsoft Azure, at least in the dynamic space, to connect to their applications. So Once you have your connection set up, configured, saved, you've got your company pulled in, then we can actually look at building out your integrations, either to or from finance. So for integrating into, well, in either case, if you're pulling data out or sending data in, like I mentioned, we're using the OData services inside of finance and operations. The benefit to that is they're the latest service endpoints that we can work with. In the past, AX, if you worked with AX on-prem, they had SOAP endpoints for years. They updated, they had REST services as well. Their OData endpoints are the newest version of all of those, so we're working with that. We do work with F&O online only currently. We don't have it tested out fully for on-prem F&O deployments for those customers that are still using that. But for anything online, we connect through the connection window like I walked through there. We use the OData endpoints to connect, and then we also handle custom services like I mentioned earlier. So if you're not seeing an object in the list when we're looking at the data source or the destination, there is a property on any object in F&O that you can go and customize or change that is pretty much states whether it is public or not. So when you mark that as is public, it's going to be picked up by the OData services, and then as a result, when we query those and get the metadata back from SmartConnect, we're going to see that object in the list, and we're going to be able to interact with it like we could any other object in F&O. So I'll show you a integration that's partially built on here. I'm not going to build one from scratch. I'm mainly focused on the features or the windows that are going to be a little bit different for F&O compared to our other destinations. So this one, data source doesn't matter a whole lot. I believe this integration, I just had it pulling from Excel, but literally any other connection you set up or REST connector, we can pull our data from. I'm going to orders, in this case, sales orders in F&O, because I wanted to show an integration that has a header and a line item on it, because those interact a little bit differently now from our other connections. And some of this functionality is going to be rolled back to our other connections. So I want to talk about it on here because it's going to make your lives a bit easier when you're looking to set up integrations in general across SmartConnect. So the first thing I want to look at is the target tab on here. This is where we're pointing it to my finance connection that I have set up. I get to choose what company it goes to by default. Again, like any other destination we have in SmartConnect, you can split your integration out to multiple companies if you want to. So you can send it to multiple companies in bulk if you want. So if you have a set of master records to upload, you can send those to all the companies you want to at one time and upload them in each. Or if you have records that should be split out record by record, and each record should run to a different company, you can go ahead and define that inside of our company's custom window, where you can actually look at the source data that we're bringing in and say, hey, if I have an identifier in there, I can use that with a bit of scripting to say, you know, this record should run to one company, this record should run to another. So it's fairly powerful in terms of using one integration to split stuff out to multiple companies. And that isn't specific to F&O, that works across all of our standard connections for their destination. Now, what I wanted to talk about here is a couple new features that we've got in SmartConnect. One is a parallel send option. So with Dynamics Finance, when you call into their OData services, SmartConnect by default is still sending one record at a time sequentially. So record 1, record 2, record 3, we wait for the response back. But by default with Finance, we actually send those records in parallel. So if you're uploading, I don't know, 1,000 records into F&O, SmartConnect on the back end will determine how many different endpoints or instances of those services there are, and it'll actually split the record count out and send those all in at once. So you might have, might split that 1,000 records into 5 parallel processes of 200 records each that are each going to their own OData endpoint for that same destination, but it's going to process a lot quicker. So that's not something you have to set up on your end to determine how many parallel processes there are. That's something SmartConnect will determine based on the F&O deployment and how many resources and how the web services are configured on that end to find the right number to send it through. So this is not something that's available anywhere else in SmartConnect yet. This is something that's going to be coming to customer engagement and to Business Central and CRM. But this is the first destination that it is enabled on. Now, we did include an option to disable that parallel send if you want. So disabling that will obviously slow down the integration because once again, we go back to waiting for each record to process before the next one is sent in. But there are some instances in which you would want to do that. The main thing being if you want to run a process or you need the records to run in one at a time and you have like a document level task or another process that runs between each record that requires you to know which order those records go in that case, it would make sense to go ahead and disable this. If you don't care about the order of the records going in, which is the case the majority of the time, then I would say leave this on, and it's going to let you send through records much quicker than they used to in the past for other destinations. The other thing we're doing on the back end, which isn't so important to you as an end user, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, is we are offloading some of this effort and some of this work to what we call a microservice on the back end. All that means is it should not impact the overall, in terms of SmartConnect.com, the overall service performance of your session that you have running, anyone else that is running theirs that might be in that same server cluster as you. We're moving a lot of this processing of sending data to finance off to its own little mini service, the microservice, so it can process there and then report back when it's done. So as an end user, not as important for you guys to know about that, except for the fact that we're trying to improve your lives, improve performance in general of SmartConnect, so we can go ahead and scale that up. All right, so the other new thing we have on here is how you choose your destination endpoints. So if you're again, I refer back to a lot of Business Central, Customer Engagement, CRM. If you're used to those systems in SmartConnect, you have to pick which endpoint you want to send the data to. We've changed it up slightly in here. You can send to more than one service endpoint if you want using the ad service, but what we really made the change on is how you relate different endpoints to one another. So if you're doing a transaction type entry, like sales orders, invoices, whatever the case, anything that's got a header and lines, this is where we're going to want to use the child endpoint so we know how to relate one service to another. So just in general, first off, doing the ad service, if I click that, I can see the service list coming back from my finance instance on here. Again, anything marked as is public should appear, and I can go ahead and select from this list. If you're familiar with finance, what you're going to see, like when we get to the customer option, is there's going to be multiple versions of the endpoint. This is how Microsoft did versioning on their API, is they didn't do a completely different version number for the entire API. They started doing version numbers on specific endpoints. So if you're going through the list and you see a V2 or a V3, different ones, those are just newer versions of the same endpoint on there. So again, I don't know off the top of my head what Microsoft changes between each and every endpoint, but if you wanted to, you could probably look through it and see what they've done. Now, picking the service just adds it to the list here. Again, like I mentioned though, if you're doing like a transaction, you've got header and lines, or even customers, there's a potential to put child endpoints on there, like customer addresses or different codes underneath of them. We can use this child endpoints form to set that up. Now, today, for some reason, I'm having a bit of a display issue, so you guys are gonna have to bear with me. I've got part of the team looking at why this window doesn't pop out the full way that it's supposed to. So apologies for that, but everything is still functioning in here like I wanted to show. So the first thing you can do is add your child service. Now, ours was already added in that I wanted, the sales order line, but any other one that you might wanna relate to that header, you could go ahead and drop in here as well. But for my case, I wanted the sales order line added in. Now, what we get to do with that once you choose child services is you get to pick parent fields. So this is something new to finance that we are 100% moving back to other destinations, especially CRM and customer engagement, because what this allows us to do is actually retrieve and save fields that either get generated on the parent record or that you pass in as part of that parent record without having to go back and look them up again. So the main one for list, the parent field we're concerned about if we're doing a sales order header and a sales order line underneath it, is going to be that sales order number from the header. I want to know what that header sales order number is for every line that I'm passing through under it. Now, might not be a big deal if you have the sales order number in your source data, but a lot of times you're going to want F&O or another destination, another ERP to generate that number for you. And what we used to have to do in the past is we'd have to go look up that record that we just created. We'd create the header, then go look up that sales order number on that header and pull it back in through a type of field lookup or entity lookup in SmartConnect that you, the user, would have to set up. Now we do that all automatically, and we do it one time, no matter how many lines are on there. So it's going to make it easier for you guys to go ahead and retrieve values that get generated in a header automatically, and it's going to be more efficient because we're not doing it for every single line. We do that one time, and then we save that data for every line that happens to be used. So it's a little bit more setup on the beginning when we're in here, but the idea is, all right, we grab the sales order header. I can then tell it what to do if there's no data there. So a lot of times you don't want to pass in lines if there's no header for it, so you can just restrict them out. But you can do default values. You can return a null depending on your specific scenario. So we can go ahead and use all that. We can even group on that field if we wanted to. Normally you won't be doing that, but there is the option there as well. And I'll show you what this ends up looking like in the field level mapping, because it makes it a lot easier later on. So that's the biggest thing that I wanted to show on there. Now, when we get to the field level mapping, this is going to be very similar to any other destination if you used .com before, so I'm not going to step through it in a massive amount of detail, but I do want to talk about a couple things on here. One, this integration is only part done, so I've only got a handful of fields that are mapped like the account number on here. But two, one thing I wanted to talk about are fields that show up as required. So since we're pulling back metadata from the OData services, they do flag which fields are required when it pulls that information back. That is not technically the case when you pass it in through the API though. So even though sales order number is required, like if you were on the UI in the user interface in finance, you tried to save a sales order without a sales order number, it obviously wouldn't let you because that sales order number is required. However, normally that sales order number is auto-populated. Now, from our perspective and how we have it set up, we don't have to do anything special to get that number to auto-populate. We also don't require you to map a field to this quote unquote required field on here. So that's a question I get a lot. This functions the exact same way when you're running to CRM or customer engagement. Their API will flag fields as required because that's what it is through the user interface, but the API doesn't force you to pass them in. So if I leave the sales order number field blank, when it sends that call into finance, it's going to go hit the correct endpoint, create the sales order header because that's the mapping that I'm on right now, and it's going to auto create that sales order number for us, just like if there was a user going through and creating that in the interface. Now, this is where that parent-child field option comes in very handy, because it's going to auto create it on the header because that's the one that I happen to be on. But when I go to the line, that does not auto create the sales order number for us. So in the past, this is where I mentioned we'd have to do like a field lookup or an entity lookup and grab that sales order number from the header that we just created. We don't have to do that any longer. So if I scroll down here and take a look at my sales order number field, there is a new field type in here called parent source column. If I choose that, that lets me choose from my list of parent source fields that I had defined on the header. So the only one I defined on here was my sales order number on the header, so that's the one I'll choose. But that's going to allow SmartConnect to handle all of that on the back end. So when we send through the sales order request, it will generate the header, it will auto-populate the sales order number. Immediately that's sent back to SmartConnect and held in memory for this map execution. And then as each line processes, it's just going to dump that sales order number in there for us without us having to do anything tricky, without us having to look it up on each line or anything like that. So that is something that is a new feature to our F&O connection, and it's something we're 100% moving back to our other connection types, hopefully in the near future, because it makes setup a whole lot easier when you're doing transaction-based integrations. Now, the other thing that's specific for F&O on the destination side, I'll talk about this, and then I'll talk about the data sources briefly before I let everyone go, is the additional column type that we have added in here. If you're not familiar with additional columns, these let you do different manipulations to the data or look up different data based on where we're sending it to. So a few of these column types will change depending on your destination. So in this case, we have an F&O specific one called an F&O Lookup. What this allows us to do is create a lookup that runs as the integration is processing. And if you have this additional column mapped on a particular line or a particular field mapping. It's going to process for every record that gets sent through. And what it lets us do is look up data from anywhere else in our destination F&O system. You could actually look up data from a different F&O system as well if you had more than one F&O connection configured on here. So you can actually look up data across different instances. But again, not a full training, so I don't want to go through every single thing in here, but the main idea behind it is you can, once again, just like on the destination, choose any public object that we have in here. So like if I wanted to look up something off my customer, when I'm sending this data into my sales orders, I can go ahead and pull in my customer V3 service. I can then choose which field or fields I want to pull off of here. So I don't know if there's a, we could go ahead and grab my tax group. I could grab I grabbed the wrong tax group, so let's grab them both, grab a sales segment, whatever we needed off the particular customer. I could then go ahead and pass in my source data on here and compare it to my customer over here. So I could compare my customer account. I may have grabbed the wrong field, again, just an illustration here, but I can compare a field or more than one field between my source data and that destination service. And if it finds a match, it's going to return all of my return fields on here, which then become mappable in the integration. So this just lets us get additional data fields out of F&O, out of different record types as we're sending data in to use them on the current integration. And there's all kinds of options that we can go ahead and enable on here between companies when it should run, whether it runs early or late in the process, which is more of a training thing than me droning on the webinar here. So that's the destination. There's a couple really handy features, functionality that we have in there compared to other ones. I did want to touch on the data source as well, because setting up the data source is a little bit different from other connections we've had. Right now for our F&O connection, we do only support bulk data sources. One of the features that we have in progress right now is our change-based integration. So that's going to allow us to go ahead and track changes that have occurred since the last time an integration is ran and pull those out. For right now though, if you're pulling data from F&O, you do have to use that bulk data source option, but we do give you full control over doing OData filtering on any data that you want to retrieve from your system. So I'm just, once again, going to call this test because I'm really bad at making up stuff on the fly. I can pull it from my finance connection, and then we have the option of pulling that data from specific companies, like the default one we have selected, or you could go ahead and do a query across all companies. Obviously, that's going to take a bit longer to run depending on how many companies you have in your particular F&O instance. So I have quite a few here, which is going to go ahead and jack up the time quite a bit. But I'm going to leave it at the one. I'm going to find my service that I want to pull that data from. And once again, just like the destination, any object that's marked as public is pulling back through our OData endpoints on here. So I'm going to do an easy one just that everybody recognizes for the customer endpoint. You can add more than one service if you want in here. So if you wanted to add multiple services that you're actually going to kind of join together in some manner, you can do it on this list here too. So if I grab customer and let's say like customer group, something like that, as I'm going through, I can select fields from each. After I validate it, I can actually determine how I want those services joined together in my query builder portion of SmartConnect. But to keep it simple on this first particular one, I'll just grab data from my customer endpoint because it gives us a few options. First thing we have to decide on here on the right is which fields I want pulled off that service. By default, we don't mark any fields. This is a change for this connector compared to ones we have in the past. Something we're going to roll back is a lot of our other connections by default, we return every field off the service, and that is horrible design. If you leave that for live integrations, we expect people to go ahead and filter that down just to the columns or the fields they need. But it's human nature not to do that. If your fields are included in the full list, you'll just pull everything. So in this case, we leave none of them selected to start with, and we have you select which columns or fields you want returned off that particular service. We do have that select all button if you want to grab everything, but I recommend grabbing just the fields you need. You're going to have much better performance if you're pulling back, your 20 columns you need for an integration versus all 150 on a service endpoint when you're not going to use the majority of them. So that just lets us choose which fields we want to pull from there. The clipboard option lets us put on our filtering. So this is full OData filtering. So all the service endpoints, like I've mentioned multiple times on the webinar here, we're connecting to the OData endpoints from F&O. So we have full control over writing our OData queries inside of here. So we do list all the fields that you may have on that service. We do give you some helpers on the OData options on here. So I could go ahead and say my address. Oh, let's go ahead, like address, country, region ID. I could drag that in. I could go to my my option over here. We could say, come on, equals, and then I could say, you know, USA or whatever the code happens to be. So this is a fairly dumb example of an OData filter, but you can go ahead and join these together. We try to give you some helpers if you're not familiar with OData filtering. If you want more resources, those are definitely available online. There's plenty of different sites that give you all the syntax and functionality that you might need on how to write your OData queries. But this is essentially unlimited. Anything you could do in an OData filter, you could do inside of this window to get it filtered down to just what you need. One thing I will point out, and again, depending on people's experience level with F&O on this call, is a lot of those objects by default in F&O do not have a last date modified field, which makes it difficult to put an OData filter to say, pull me everything where the last date modified is, you know, greater than or equal to yesterday or today or something like that. That's normally an OData filter that you can do. What I have seen with different customers is that they've actually loaded in customizations or extensions that add a last date modified field to those objects, so they can go ahead and use that when they're tracking what data has been changed inside of F&O. So again, that's something you may have to do if you're working with the bulk data source for right now. Again, before the end of the year, we're looking at putting in a change data source where SmartConnect will be able to track the changes for you using a slightly different API endpoint from F&O to accomplish that. Finally, the only thing else I wanted to mention on the data source side that's new on here is we do bundle in related services as a child endpoint under this if we wanted to. So when you pick customers, for example, these are all the services that the F&O metadata show up as saying related to the customer endpoint. So you can click on these, you can figure out what which ones you want. Like if I wanted to pull in my dimension sets on here, I can check that, and then I get to choose which fields come off of that service as well. So you can't filter on these sub-services on here, but you can choose which fields you want to return based on that, which makes it fairly powerful. All right, so that lasted, that went a little bit longer than I expected it to. Normally I try to keep these at a half an hour or less, but there's a lot of new functionality in here. And we want to make sure if somebody hasn't seen this before, I give them an idea of what to look for when they're setting it up their first time. If there's any comments or questions, throw them in now into the chat, or you could have during the session here. I don't see any currently. So I'll wait just a couple minutes as I wrap up here. Otherwise, we will call it a day. So once again, thank you all for those of you that attended live. Thank you for anyone that's watching this on a recording. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me at chris.hansen@e1solutions.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I don't use Twitter much. Don't reach out to me there. You might not get a response right away. But LinkedIn, through my normal email, call into E1, or just contact anyone on the E1 team, and we can make sure you get directed to the right person, depending on what your question or inquiry is. So yeah, not seeing any questions right now. Thank you all. Once again, I hope everyone has a great day. See ya.